And welcome all of you here for this time together. I'm Ruth Roselle, Director of the Butchie Center for Peace and Nonviolence at Central Seminary, and am delighted to welcome you to this second session of Continuing Education Series, Faith Leadership in the Context of Climate Change. I know you are really busy, and as I said before, some of you came in, we were together for a whole day on Saturday, so I know that added to your busyness. Um, but I'm so appreciative of all of you taking the time. I think this is a really important subject, so it's delightful to be together as we discuss the challenges and the opportunities of ministry in the context of the changing climate. As I mentioned, just tell us where you're from in the chat. We're some here in Kansas City area, but we're across the country, and there's some folks that have registered that are zooming in from a couple different continents. So that's always kind of fun to both connect with those close by and realize, and see those who are from quite a distance as well. So the first session of the series focused on better understanding climate change as that context in which we're working these days, and to help us understand the science of climate change and its causes, its impacts, and its solutions. We heard from climate scientist Dr. Lee Stearns. And if any of you were not able to attend that first session, I know some of you had told me, and I said we can get that made up by if you watch the recording. So I did send the link, and if you haven't watched that yet, please do, because that's important to understand that for us to have confidence as faith leaders in talking about this whole subject. But today we have the Reverend Dr. Greg Hunt with us to speak about the subject of biblical, theological, and ethical perspectives on climate change and creation care as a way of helping us develop this eco-theological grounding that is really important as faith leaders for us to be confident and deeply connected into as we speak from our perspective of faith. Dr. Hunt will speak for about an hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for us to engage together, both asking questions that may have come up for you that you'd really like to talk about, or just kind of discussion about some of the things that he's brought to us. You can either write those in the Q&A, or you can just bring them forward at the end. We're a small enough group, we're not like pages and pages of Zoom people, that we can just engage in that conversation. But feel free to put them in the Q&A too, and I'll look at those. I will not necessarily follow the chat closely, so if you have a question you want to have me ask, put it in the Q&A. And then, of course, stay muted during the presentation out of consideration for others, and also because we are recording this session, and it makes it a little bit easier for that. So Dr. Greg Hunt is the research professor and supplemental assistant professor of theology here at Central Seminary. But he does a lot of teaching here, and he does quite a bit of the DMin theological teaching. So he is a great person to be in this continuing education series for faith leaders. He also serves as president of Directions Incorporated, a nonprofit that he and his wife Priscilla formed to serve people as they lead their organizations, relationships, and lives. He has authored 2 books, Blackbird Singing in the Dead of Night, What to Do When God Won't Answer, and Leading Congregations Through Crisis, 2 great books, 2 great topics. And he's also authored and co-authored numerous other articles on theology, leadership, and couple relationships. Dr. Hunt has a BA in history from Baylor University and has earned his MDiv and his PhD theology degrees from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. He served as pastor of churches in Kentucky, Louisiana, Missouri, and Oklahoma. And more recently, he may have added some more, I'm not sure, but recently he's been interim minister as well. And he and Priscilla continue to work, I believe, in marriage education movement, have 2 married children and 3 granddaughters. So we are really delighted to have Dr. Hunt with us today to talk about theology that's related to climate change. So welcome, Dr. Hunt, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Great to see everybody. And as your faces appeared and names appeared, I see some of you who I've had the pleasure of getting to know personally as a student, an ongoing relationship. Like Michael, great to see you. It's been a while. Colleagues and faculty members, Chris Wilson and I have the disciples connection. I have Baptist roots and have standing with disciples now, which has been a real privilege. Though I would also add that my wife and I are now attending an Anglican church in Overland Park, and the beat goes on. So today we do want to take advantage of this opportunity to connect our conversation to the root systems of our faith, to understand it in that deeper and broader perspective, to contextualize the ongoing conversation. I've got a PowerPoint support for my presentational component, but I look forward to our interacting as well. And I'm going to go ahead and bring that PowerPoint up so that it can guide our conversation. And there we go. Everybody see it okay? While I'm doing the presentation, I'm looking now at a screen that's got a few of your faces and doesn't have other faces. If there is something, a question you need to raise, unmute yourself. We'll tend to that. As Dr. Roselle mentioned, I'll just assume that this early part is presentational mode, and that still means that you can insert your questions, voice, need for clarification before we go on, whatever. I want to focus our conversation as we talk about creation care theologically with an understanding that all of this is integrated. And so there is an ethical dimension to our theological conversation. You can't just have this conversation in isolation. I think, in fact, that many of the things we'll want to talk about after the presentation will connect the theological and the ethical. Can we acknowledge at the outset that in the very process of having this conversation, we have to establish the connection between the topic and the challenge, namely that all is not well, and that there are serious questions about history and current circumstances and future prospects as it relates to the environment. And as those who connect to this as a faith matter, it poses some very serious questions for us about how our Christian faith either supports the flourishing of our natural resources, our world, our ecosystem, or the counterpart, how we collude with the damage, the destruction, the dangers that we are confronting as a people on a global scale. And we have to begin by saying that the reality is there are lots of different dimensions of the exploitation of our natural resources, the ecosystem within which we live. And in fact, let me just enumerate fairly rapidly. You can write these down and we can talk about each of them separately later. But can we establish that among the problems we're dealing with the exploitation of the environment are, one, anthropocentrism, which is the tendency for human beings to put themselves at the center and to see the rest of nature and the world as in utilitarian terms, so that it becomes all about us. and I'm going to come back to these as it has to do with Christian faith, because these five elements I'm mentioning, the first being anthropocentrism, do force us to ask theological questions and to be honest about how Christianity can be a co-conspirator in problems that emerge, or can be a source of wisdom and guidance and health. So first is the tendency for humanity to put ourselves right in the middle and to use the resources of nature for our own selfish, self-centered benefits. The second issue has to do with power and our understanding of power, and the tendency of some to see power in terms of domination. Third issue is a tendency to deny our interconnectedness, so that we particularize and divide the elements of nature into separate units and not necessarily see the interconnections between them. A fourth issue has to do with the assumption of limitless resources. And I think if we were to just say, hey, let's just get online right now and Google current events, we would quickly establish evidence of how we in our society have created an entire integrated system that promotes using up resources as if there is no end. I was having a conversation just yesterday with someone about the fundamental realities of capitalism, and specifically this issue of inflation. Just stop and consider what happens with inflation. Why would prices inevitably rise? And the only way you can address that and answer that is to say that there is woven within the systems of our economic exchanges this profit motive that keeps the supply and demand chain moving in a way that benefits the profit makers and creates stresses on both ends of this equation and keeps the upward pressure on prices moving. That is just one element of a kind of reality that promotes the idea that we can keep getting bigger and better and find more resources and continue to use them so that we can satisfy the demands of the consumer, and on it goes. I'm not here to debate capitalism per se, and I'm a beneficiary of it, so I don't want to just trash it. But it does highlight that these are complicated issues with, on a global scale, people having an incentive to keep drawing on and using our resources to satisfy demands, needs, interests, and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle that complicates our conversation when it has to do with the environment. The last one that I will mention relates to what I've just said, which has to do with unchecked consumerism. Just got to keep buying, got to get getting more, got to get getting better, got to keep this whole pressure system of endless need and endless desire comes into play. There are theological implications to all of those. So with that as kind of a sobering reality about the nature of the crisis and the tendencies of exploitation, the next question has to do with Christian faith. And here it is for each of us to ponder. Is it possible that Christian faith itself is bad for the environment. There are, in fact, and have been for a long time, those who would aim blames specifically at biblical faith, Christians, and the heritage of Christianity on this problem. And not without some support in history. And my basic to my presentation this morning is the sense that bad theology has been a troubling source and one of the root causes actually endorsing exploitation. And it's harder right now than ever to evade that conclusion when there are those engaged in forms of Christianity who are at work in policy making, in power systems in our nation right now, who are doing away with statistical analysis because it's inconvenient, who are dismissing the value of scientific research and its findings, who are ignoring some of those findings in policy development, not only for domestic issues, but on a global scale, influencing how much money is being set aside for environmental and health, nutritional issues in other very vulnerable cultures, where the reality is sometimes those who are least contributing to environmental problems are the ones suffering the greatest from the consequences of the improper balance and improper use of things. Well, behind that is sometimes those who are supporting these efforts with a version of Christianity that actually does see power as dominance and disregards the interconnected nature of life. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time in a bashing of that theology. I want to spend more time in establishing what we could consider more responsible, biblically centered theology as it relates to creation in the world. So here are some pegs we can start hanging our perspectives on and build a kind of vision of the environment, of nature, of the world as created by God. And we start with the theological affirmation, in the beginning, God. It doesn't take a lot for us to recognize that this is foundational to our faith. And by doing this, we are affirming that the world as we have it, the universe as we have it, is not pure accident, that we don't explain the existence of all that is by pure chance. We understand this is a confessional point of view, but we center our convictions in faith in the beginnings of the biblical perspective with the very first words from the very first book of our canon, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was God. God is behind the world as we have it. And this God, as we come to understand this God more fully, and we'll talk about that momentarily, offers us the perspective of a world that was brought into being with intentionality and with particular motives. And out of that comes an appreciation for what it means for us to be a part of it. A little bit more about this God, and this may be a term that is new to some of you, the term panentheism. In classical theological terms, when we're talking about a faith in God, that God is the center reality, foundational reality for us, we talk about that in terms of theism, the belief in God. And that's sometimes contrasted with pantheism, with the notion that all is God and God is all. Pantheism tends to submerge the divine within the framework of creation so that they are one and the same. That the one we call God is all of nature, and nature is all of God. Panentheism is a way of understanding both the immanence of God, God within creation, and the transcendence of God, God above creation, and drawing those two together so that we can affirm that God is both above and intimately engaged in creation, so that you have a much more lively and personal, intimate understanding of God without eliminating an appreciation for the guiding wisdom, power, and love of God that superintends the world, that cannot be subsumed within, consumed by creation itself. And write that term down, and if you want to talk a little bit more about that later, be happy to. But I would simply assert that this is my personal conviction on a theological basis, that I would affirm as having great biblical roots, and as a significant way to have this conversation about the environment. You'll see in the image there the kind of Trinitarian dimension. Father, Son, Holy Spirit is how some would say it. Others would talk about it to move beyond gender, but talk about God as creator, God as incarnate in the one Jesus, the Word made flesh, and the Spirit that hovers and broods from the foundations of creation, empowers and enlivens and sustains, and is engaged in the very breath of life, and continues to function with freedom and grace and power in the world as we have it, and is the power, the force of love that continues to guide and move all of creation toward its conclusion. So with panentheism, we have God in and beyond creation, in intimate, loving relationship with all of humanity and all of creation. I love this way of making sense of my experience of faith, my understandings of the scripture, how all of the connective tissue of this works together. I think it's important also, as we look at the biblical perspective on the world as we have it, of theology of creation, that we can note from the outset that as the creation story unfolds, we see it in Genesis 1 and a variation of it in Genesis 2, but it's in the Genesis 1 variation on the story of creation that we have the narrative pause at points, key points along the way, and we see the observation, and God saw what he had made, and behold, it was good. And then in the culminating example of that, it amplifies that observation. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. An observation that is made after humanity enters the picture. I want to note at this point that when we think theologically about creation and humanity, it has great value for us to understand humanity within creation, not as a creation and then humanity as if humanity has a separate place. And in fact, if you, many of you who've studied theology would actually find that in the treatment of theology, there's a whole unit on creation, and then later there's a whole unit on humanity. And the tendency is for humanity to be addressed in a way that can, if we're not careful, cut it off from creation. And I would urge us to understand humanity, first of all, as woven into the fabric of creation, as integral to the story of the whole, and that has great importance for how we see ourselves, not over and above creation, not as distinct in terms of God having an interest in us that's not as important as God's love for creation. And I would suggest that this is very important because there is a tendency in some theological frameworks to treat creation as if it's merely the backdrop to the more significant story of faith, which has to do with sin and salvation and the destiny of humanity. I have a daughter who is a professor at Kent State University in the theater department, and as you would imagine, they're constantly doing productions and they're creating stage sets for their productions, and they want to create sort of visual worlds that can support the storyline. And I think in theology, sometimes we are guilty of looking at creation as if it's that sort of set design that's all put into place at one level of realism or another, so as to provide a context for the most important thing to go on, which is namely the human story. And I think that is flawed theology, and it is dangerous theology. And it has implications for how we then treat the world around us. I think this is happening in pulpits, it's happening in small groups and Bible studies, it's happening in the way churches function. And so it has practical ramifications. Humanity separated from a thoroughgoing, deep appreciation for a healthy theology of creation. So let's place humanity where it belongs. And if you look at that image, you can see humanity. But humanity is a part of the overall ecosystem. It is a webbed reality with one thing interfacing with another. We are a part of the whole, each impacted by and impacting the other elements. Seeing it holistically is essential. I also think we have to confront, if we're going to do an honest theology, realities that go beyond humanity's contribution to the challenges of our ecosystem. The images that I put on the screen are reminders of an unfinished creation, whether it's volcanoes erupting in Hawaii or the parched lands of deserts that have much less rainfall, and that being true even separate and apart from what's going on in our ecological crises today. Think about tornadoes and hurricanes, lightning and thunder that strikes the earth and sets fires ablazing, or what's happening with glacial systems that across and beyond the history of humanity have been at work, both the calving of fresh glacial systems and the melting of other systems. These are realities that we have to confront, and they create the necessity to talk about the wildness of nature. I think one of the ways we develop a healthy, mature theology of creation is to acknowledge that the world is created by God, was set in motion, but is unfinished. That we have the story of the origins of creation, and we also have within the biblical narrative this aiming toward a future of what in the Hebrew tradition is called shalom, where all of the elements of creation and humanity and all of the rest of living creation are moving together in a rich, flourishing harmony. And part of that has to do with harnessing the power of creation so that its destructive elements are more effectively managed. So there is an unfinished quality, a certain wildness to it, and the reality that because of that, in human terms, there is sometimes suffering that can be attributed to nature's wildness. Integral to Christian theology for a healthy understanding of this topic is to look at humanity and our place in the whole as a matter of stewardship. And I'm guessing that as we meet today, the very fact that you're part of this conference suggests that you've already settled this matter in your mind. But we as Christian leaders need to understand that we must constantly remind those and introduce people to a fresh understanding of power and our place in the mix. That the power we hold is not just the power to exploit resources as consumers, as those who are narcissistically in the center of it all, with everything feeding our voracious appetites, but instead, as portrayed in Genesis chapter 1, God, in calling us to life, calls us into a mission as partners with God, as co-creators with God. From the outset, God blesses and says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And that this idea of subduing and dominion is not a power over, but a power with, is a stewardship that connects also with the affirmation that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, that the earth does not belong to us to clutch, to claim, to use, but to hold in stewardship while we're alive for its good, for our good, for the good of future generations, in this missional agenda to serve with God in the fulfillment of an unfinished creation, so that we are managing its resources in a loving, generous way. At this point, I think we can also, in our theology, address creation in light of the Christ, in light of the incarnation, in light of that dimension of how our faith instructs us in the imperfect circumstances we face. The book by Elizabeth Johnson, Creation and the Cross, is one example among many, and I've singled it out, but if you're interested, there are others who are in a perceptive kind of way bringing our understanding of the incarnation of God in human flesh, of the story, the narrative of Jesus, the death and resurrection, both as historical reality and as theologically significant wisdom, to even more deeply connect ourselves to the complications of our realities in ecological terms, the suffering of those who are most suffering in light of our complications, and a hope even that comes out of that, that is a realistic hope for us and a guide for our lives as followers of Christ, as those who continue to steward creation in the name of the one who willingly bears the suffering of our aching world as it yearns for fulfillment. A bit more of what Elizabeth Johnson had to say that I think just jumps to the pinpoint of her perspective and gives us a theological angle of vision. I'll read this panel and the following one, and then we'll move forward. To sum up, and this is something she wrote at the end of this book to literally sum up all that was being presented in the book. To sum up, the living God, gracious and merciful, always was, is, and will be, accompanying the world with saving grace, including humans in their sinfulness, and humans and all creatures in their unique beauty, evolutionary struggle, and inevitable dying. The cross does not change this truth or occasion a shift in God's attitude from betrayed honor to willingness to forgive. It does make the compassionate love of God's heart blazingly clear in an historical event. The death of Christ becomes an icon of God's redemptive co-suffering with all sentient life, as well as the victims of social competition. To recall Gregerson's insight, in Jesus Christ crucified, we are gifted with an historical sacrament of encounter with the mercy of God, which impels us toward conversion to the suffering earth, sustained by hope for the resurrection of the flesh of all of us. And then, as with any theology, the path laid down here will prove its worth if the faith convictions it generates motivate individuals and communities to passionate, ethical, practical commitments to the natural world in tandem with all the earth's poor and marginalized people. A whole agenda arises when we realize that for this conversion to take root, it needs to find expression in church liturgies and Eucharistic prayers, in religious art and music, in public preaching and teaching, and in private prayers and spirituality and devotional writing. There is a long road ahead before such generous commitment to the earth becomes commonplace, but many are making a beginning. You pause over those words for a minute, and in fact, I'm going to step out of kind of presentational mode because some of you may have been writing down key phrases or others. Does anybody need me to go back and give you a little more time on any of those key words and phrases? You can speak up because I can't see everybody. On this particular screen, let's overlay there the reminder. There's a kind of a worship focus on the tail end of this, and step back from that and look in larger terms to a question that I find not necessarily ignored, but underplayed significantly in churches across North America. because I'll regularly be in congregations and ask the question, what are you doing in practical terms as a congregation to deal with the environmental challenges of today? And, what are you teaching? Are you doing practical steps to recycle? Are you managing issues in terms of your use of electricity? What are your engagements in terms of eco-justice? Or we start raising those questions, and in the better congregations, they've got a waste can in their supply room where they're trying to separate what's recyclable. They may be doing a study from time to time or had an annual feature in worship. But over and over again, I see a kind of sheepish response from those who are saying, we're struggling to figure out exactly how to make that happen, and it's very difficult. Well, indeed, it is. But if we're taking this kind of theological perspective seriously, it will put the pressure on us. There will be a mandate to do something, and it will, as Professor Johnson puts it, prove its worth if those convictions translate into practical commitments and actions. And I know that that's at the heart of what this whole study together is about. I appreciate that the keynote of hope was included in those words, and I think it has great value for us in theological terms. And I would separate the idea of hope from optimism. Optimism is the conviction that there is, in the very nature of reality, a built-in tendency toward progress for positive outcomes. So optimism says it's all going to turn out well in the end, because things just tend to turn out well in the end. And we know the conversation about some people are glass half full type people, and others are glass half empty type people. Reality doesn't really care which of those two we are. It has a life of its own. So optimism can become a little passive. So it's all going to just, pan out in the end. But hope is different from that. And hope is something that we can sustain even in the crucible of deep realism about complications and the nature of corporate evil and systemic patterns of destruction. Hope is rooted not in the built-in nature of things, but in the nature and purpose of God. We rest our hope as a people of faith in our conviction that the God who makes promises will bring those promises to fulfillment, and that the God of promise is a God of love, that it is in the very nature of our Trinitarian God, this one who by very nature is a loving community of interactive, mutually self-giving love, to move and draw all of creation into the wholeness of God's love toward an end of shalom, of the flourishing of creation, of a generous and generative dynamism, this eternal picture that artists like Rousseau, as depicted here, display with peace and harmony and mutual support and self-giving. That image is integral to biblical faith, and you can see it in Genesis all the way to Revelation, and the imaginative images in the final chapters of the book of Revelation with the streams of life, the flourishing city, the wellspring of the fulfillment of the whole. Which brings to the question of eco-justice, because throughout the biblical text we have reminders like the one I've displayed here that is from Amos chapter 5. Let justice roll down like water, righteousness like a mighty stream. The mandate that comes with our vision of God and our vision of the world as a part of what it means to live out our life together in keeping with the spirit of God. And that includes an appreciation for what we talk about as eco justice. Uh, Eco justice has to do with an appreciation for the connection between environmental protection and social justice. It recognizes that marginalized communities bear a disproportionate share of the harm that comes when we aren't honoring this critical theological faith commitment as stewards of creation. Eco-justice fights against systemic inequality, racism, that exposes some populations more than others to the effects of pollution and health hazards and climate change impacts. It focuses on the importance of fair treatment, meaningful involvement of communities, empowering them in policymaking, regulations, and holding ourselves accountable for the concerns and needs environmentally, working together to prevent disproportionate harm, holding accountable those polluters and policymakers who have outsized impact on things. And it has to do with equal access to environmental benefits. If we affirm a theological perspective of a good God creating a wonderful world, inviting us into stewardship, not just exploitation and domination, then all of us together are a part of this web of life. None is more important than another, and all of that becomes essential to how we translate our faith into a healthy stewardship and fair treatment and participation together. We can go deeper there as we talk about this, but it has deep implications. I'm going to stop there and give it back to you, Dr. Roselle, and we can have a conversation as you see fit.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. Very, very rich and provocative, and there, one feels one could keep on going
Yes.
hearing all that you have to say. So I really appreciate that. There are no questions in the Q&A that are written down. So now I would invite any of you to unmute yourself and ask your question, or if you feel more comfortable, raise your hand, and then we'll see that you're wanting to speak. But you're all a theological group, and I'm sure have thoughts that are waiting to, or comments, building on something that Dr. Hunt said, not necessarily
Yeah,
asking.
and I'll be happy to pose questions as well, but want you all to have first shot.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have my question fully congruent, but
Yeah, just give it a go.
yeah, you sparked it when you talked about Genesis 131, God saw it was very good. Um, I remember Genesis 6:5, where God regretted having created humanity and decides to wipe out humanity and animals and birds and so on. And I guess this goes along with what you were saying about our interconnectedness. I mean, I don't know what to do with that, obviously.
Yeah.
Uh, but it also speaks to the justice piece that you mentioned as well. Um, I just wanted to throw that out there,
Yes.
the connections that it brought out for me.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that in Genesis 1 we can have God celebrating this creation, saying, not bad, not bad. This is great. And then a little bit later in the narrative, it's like, I'm not so sure. Maybe this was a mistake. And I do think there is in the biblical narrative, especially in those first 11 chapters, before you get to before Abram, who becomes Abraham, gets introduced into the narrative. Those first 11 chapters have a poetic imagination to them that seems to be of a distinct kind and definitely serves a theological purpose, which is to say, why do we have the world as we have it today?
Mm.
And why is the world not all that it was cracked up to be? Why are we facing these kinds of problems? Why are we experiencing suffering the way we are? You can bring all of those pieces in terms of the fractured, complicated mix of good, bad, ugly, that is a part of the human experience and the realities of our experience within creation to bear. And stories like that one in Genesis 6 are a part of saying, well, humanity has a part to play. We have complicated these realities rather than being contributors as stewards and co-creators with God. We're part of the problem now, so much so that the biblical narrative puts us on the brink of extinction. And I think we can all accept the reality that there are times we look at the momentum of things and even become discouraged to say, are we inevitably moving toward destruction, whether it's with a nuclear bomb or the wasting away, the heating up of our earth to the point that life becomes unsustainable. So instead, we're contemplating getting on rockets and going to a more an even more inhospitable planet to recolonize because we destroyed this. It becomes another dumping ground, and we go on to the next. It's easy to get discouraged in passages like Genesis 6. We can settle in there and stew in our juices just a little bit, but we can also then see the threads of God's grace as God ultimately decides not to do so. And there remains a remnant at the end of that story of the flood. And we then can see ourselves as a remnant. And good things can happen from remnants.
Just had a less a question and more a thought that came up as you reflected today. The one slide you had that just had unfinished and talked about creation being unfinished. I think, at least for me, I can't say for everybody else, I feel like theology is unfinished and that we're constantly evolving in our how we think about God, how we think about who we are, how we think about the relationship, how we think about the world in which we live and how we care for it. And theology, depending on how a person constructs their theology, can either be an ally in their work in the world or can be the enemy within, because there are certain theological camps that will draw a line around their theology and have this non-porous boundary. And so if something doesn't fit, then you've got a problem with how they think about creation or eco-justice, and it's outside the scope of their box. And so it limits the potential, where if you're unfinished in your theology and recognizing creation is unfinished, that we're all works in progress, we're these finite beings, and we can be open to new things and seeing that we are a part of the puzzle rather than the puzzle itself, which was kind of reflects one of your challenges at the beginning. And I think, at least for me in my theological work, I think of part of my theological work is not to be right, but to be loving. And I think there's a distinction between that in terms of how it shapes how we think, live, and behave in the world in which we function. So,
very, very good, Chris. Humility is a valuable word in our vocabulary. And I think what you're describing has that essential quality of humility about it that says, I don't have a corner on the market of the truth. There's still much to learn. Humility allows me to be honest with myself as a contributor to the problem rather than solutions. And you know, on a larger scale, as it has to do with theology, you used the term theology being unfinished. One of the exciting things that's going on in the world of theology is the continuing development of global theologies, whereas for the longest time when we were talking about theology, the focus was on Western theological sources from Europe and North America primarily. And what you have developing are what's called majority world theologies, which is that in itself is a term that invites humility to recognize that Western theology, where classical theology developed first, is really a minority. And as we begin to hear from voices in the Southern Hemisphere in developing areas of the world, African, Asian, other theologies, and even listen to those who were in North America before we arrived, we are blessed with theological perspective that honors the sacred nature of the world and our place within the web of life that doesn't clutch and hold, but is more generous and more grateful, and that honors in the ebb and flow of the cycles of life, the sense of awe in the face of the mystery of it. So, yeah, there's much we have to learn as the rest of the world speaks to us, and as our close neighbors who were here before us speak to us. Some of my deepest gains in theology have come through the voice of the indigenous people of our own country. And there is, by the way, if you aren't familiar with it, there is work going on by biblical scholars in First Nations to create translations of the Bible. And it started with the New Testament. They're expanding it now, but it's First Nations New Testament. If you don't have a copy of that, I encourage you to consider getting that. It's beautifully written with deep wisdom by scholars from multiple tribes, and really worth adding to your library, to the 100 Bibles you have on your shelf already.
Dr. Hunt, I have a question about, I was really interested in what you were talking about with power. And I want to connect what you talked about power with what you also talked about in hope. And one of the things I've always been able to do is when I'm talking about issues of faith in the environment is talk about the abundance of creation, and that there is this overwhelming sense of abundance that exists and will seemingly always be there. And yet we are maybe encountering soon this inflection point where we will see more scarcity than abundance. And so I wonder about how to articulate a sense of hope when you are looking through the lens of the other side of the curve, when things seem very, very scarce.
Right. Yeah. And there's an inherent tension, isn't there, between what I said, the myth of limitless resources is one of our problems. And yet the other side is also true. There is bounty. There is an abundance. And in fact, what you have is this tension that becomes a psychological tension and a social psychological tension. We saw it at work during the pandemic, when you'd go to the grocery store and couldn't find toilet paper because you get that mindset taking over, and now everybody's trying to get the last of a supply before it runs out, and that itself becomes self-fulfilling of the problem, because the reality was there was actually, despite disruptions in the supply chain, there was plenty, but there were some hoarding out of fear that they would run out. And all of it becomes this destructive cycle that becomes self-fulfilling. I hoard, so I've got mine, you don't get yours. There was plenty to go around. Now there's not plenty to go around. And you get this whole exchange that then turns to a new kind of exploitation. I've got lots and I can gouge, do price gouging because you need something I've got. On and on it goes. The challenge for us is how to honor the fact, the complexity of those realities together. And in doing that, we move beyond theology to the practicalities that are very ethical in nature in our life together. And I think, Michael, I appreciate what you're describing that's at the heart of your ministry, which is how you lead people to cultivate mindsets of abundance, to celebrate God's generosity, to live with trust, with open hands, and to experience creation as the gift from God that it is, and to be mindful out of the spirit of there is enough. We've got enough. We just need to be better at distribution, and the distribution starts by us opening these tight-fisted, miserly hands and to share. But then to honor, I think if we go deeper into theology, to honor the cycles of nature, the rhythms of life and death, an ecosystem that is dynamic and ongoing and moving. And it means that you've got to trust that rather than exhaust resources. You've got to put back in. Those of you who are involved closer to nature, I've never been a farmer, but I've appreciated about wise farming, the use of the land and the replenishing of its nutrition, and these elements that go on that honor the fact that there is seed planting and cultivation and harvesting and fallow ground, and all of those sorts of things are part of cycles that biblical faith honors as well, both seasonally and through Sabbath years, and all these sorts of patterns that are part of it too. The richer our understanding of those dynamics are, I think, the better stewards we become of the whole.
Dr. Hunt, I want to say thank you for the theological framework that you've given. It's certainly one that is very comfortable for me, resonates deeply with where my faith is. And I've oftentimes sort of pondered that question of recognizing there are strands of Christianity that can actually be quite problematic for caring for creation. And so I'm wondering if you, or and maybe anyone else here, has found some effective ways to reach people who maybe are embedded in those types of beliefs, because it feels like we're very much in a place where it's easy to talk to people who already agree and are like, oh yeah, I love that, that's beautiful. But for those that don't, those are the ones I might want to reach, and it can be very hard for me to even find an avenue to.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Jeff. I think this is a great place to open it up to others of you who, in the course of the practice of ministry, have found ways to bring the concepts to life, to create compelling experiences that support frankly, transformation of consciousness. Does anybody here have something to offer from your ministries? One of the things I will say as a starting point, but I do want to hear from others of you, is it's part of the reason that sometimes the most powerful teaching in a worship service is during children's sermons. Because these concepts we're talking about are not fundamentally complex. When it has to do with talking about nature and that God created the world, and talk about stewardship, generosity. When it comes to, for some of us, it's the annual emphasis for building our budgets, but hopefully it's broader than that for you, so that it's a year-round experience of how you're talking about the idea of stewardship and bringing something as simple as a plant. I think about classrooms when I was a child, and then my children, and then as a pastor, I saw children participating in taking little seeds and learning about them and putting them into the soil and being a part of watching them grow, or little chickies that's, they brought in and put it under the lamps and watch them grow and develop. You're watching the miracle of life and can honor that God was behind that. There was a boy that had a fish tank and was able to talk in a context about how he had bought what was supposed to be an ecologically self-sufficient ecosystem for his fish, and got all the little pieces in there with the natural oxidization processes and the nutrients, and put the fish in there. He said, but I still have to clean it from time to time. Reach in there and get the scum off the glass and those sorts of things. And it led him to affirm that if that's true of me, how could that not be true of our world? How do you explain this world and its ongoing ability to survive apart from some guiding hand, some providential presence that is involved in the process? Just from the child's perspective, starting there's so many wonderful educational moments that highlight various dimensions of this truth. And I think you could kind of go down through each one of them and look at them through a child's eyes and have some learning lessons that would come into play.
Hey,
Somebody
Jeff.
else.
Jeff, I just had a thought too, is, some of us that maybe be like-minded on eco-justice stuff, to start the conversation. Now, let's talk about climate change. People have already got their defense mechanisms up. And so you end up not having a healthy conversation. You end up leaving where you started. And sometimes, at least for me, sometimes not always successful, but sometimes I make some headway by starting at the bottom and working my way up toward a theological component. So like the example that Greg gave about toilet paper. We all struggle with the toilet paper thing. We can move from toilet paper to theology, abundance, and scarcity to a theology of sufficiency. And you can start with something from the grassroots up versus from the top down of a theological concept. And there might be more of an entree into maybe a changed mind around something simple as toilet paper versus let's talk about climate change. So at least for me, coming at it from the opposite side of the conversation has not always been successful, but it's been more successful than just talking about, let's talk about this, and then it not going anywhere. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Good. I think too, we live, one of our blessings is we have access through the internet, through technology, to bring our people to the world. We can do so locally. I've been involved with eco tourism, where in our own city we get on a bus together and we drive into the food deserts, or we connect with a congregation in one of those areas that has been on the short end of the stick as it has to do with eco justice, and allow them to tell their story. and for us to be able to see it with our own eyes and experience that. And then on the counterpart, to look for best practices, examples, and to go where they are. For instance, one of my former students who's in the Detroit area, who's been involved in a fairly impressive development of community gardening, and what they've done to offset some of the limitations of their particular location. Or just 2 weeks ago, when I went with a handful of others to a brand new entity in Kansas City, Missouri, called Canbees, Kanbe apostrophe S, started by the son of a chef, grew up in the restaurant business, was committed to social justice around this issue, and the lack of accessibility to healthy foods, and has developed in 8 years' time an impressive distribution business that both collects unused food from these food distributors on a large scale, some of which is resaleable, others of which is available to food banks, and has created an entrepreneurial model that I think will ultimately get exported on a national basis. But it is focused on the vulnerable, and it targets food deserts and places where people are coming to gain support. That connects, obviously, to ecological issues as well. But then we've got videos. We may not be able to get on a bus today and take our group on a day trip to Flint, Michigan, but we can know the Flint, Michigan story, where the shifting of the water supply to a lead, a toxic water supply system, and the neglect of public officials led to problems that are still being dealt with. Or Standing Rock, the Standing Rock Sioux and their battle against the redirecting of pipeline, because white folks in prosperous areas didn't want that pipeline going through their area, so put it over on the reservation where they don't have power, and you can allow them to suffer from the vulnerability of things. We have lots of ways to do demonstration experiences that show both the good news and the complicating bad news, and to raise the question and talk about it. Ask it as a question. Say, let's talk. What are you thinking when it has to do with confronting these realities anywhere on the globe, because those stories are being recorded.
I wonder, I don't know if in congregations of those who are present, if this theology is there, but I have some family members like this, and I think maybe Dr. Hunt, you do as well. And that is a kind of eschatological theology that has a whole scenario that in the end, well, God is in control and the earth will be destroyed. So this diminishes the sense of feeling like we really need to do very much to preserve the earth right now. Now, I don't know how common that is in your congregations, but I'm wondering, Dr. Hunt, if you have some thoughts about how to talk about this. It probably needs to be within the context if we're church leaders to teach a good eschatology, but beyond that.
It is definitely one of those theological dividing lines. And this is the case with other aspects of theology. There's room for differing interpretations of Scripture. And depending on how you interpret Scripture, you end up in two very different scenarios. I do, in fact, have. I'm one of four boys, and one of the four of us is part of a Christian community that basically has turned its back on society, with the sense that we're all going to hell in a slide, and that there's going to be a remnant who are saved, and that remnant is where hope lies, and it lies beyond creation itself. That the ultimate destiny of creation is obliteration, and that God will draw us up. Christ will return and gather up the saved, and then for the rest of it, subject to conflagration. And there are, I wish I could say otherwise, but there are texts of scripture that can be pulled out that aim in that direction. But we need to do good theological work and focus on texts that support healthy, more promising point of view. And there's plenty of that in context, starting in Genesis and going through the prophetic texts, and including the ultimate images of Revelation and the new heaven and the new earth, and heaven coming to earth, which is the image of the fulfillment of creation, not the replacement of the existing world. And Paul's comments in Romans chapter 8, for instance, where Paul writes about the groaning of creation, but it's a groaning of creation, a present suffering toward an ultimate fulfillment. So the Pauline image, as it has to do with creation, is not one of its ultimate demise and destruction. It is the picture of childbirth. And in fact, that's a lovely image to draw on as we're thinking of metaphors to explain things. And back to your question, Jeff, if you're at the pulpit and you're trying to explain this, drawing on the Bible's metaphors and entering into the richness of those metaphors can be very powerful. We need a theology that dives into that. And quite frankly, it also adds the benefit of a maternal perspective that can be added to a male perspective, which in, again, stereotypical terms can lend itself more toward domination as opposed to support and nurture and life-giving. But here you have nature groaning, and you have the spirit moving, and you have the promise out in front of us that calls us to hope. And so I think we do really need to opt for that narrative line that we find in the biblical text.
And can I put a plug in for ecological literacy? And as an example, in the very first Earth Day, my friends came back and said, we've got to get rid of the paper towels that have printing on them because that ink causes problems and pollution and whatnot. So we went to white paper towels. And then we discovered, well, white paper towels are actually very bad because you have to bleach them. So we thought brown paper towels are the answer. And today we should take our old t-shirts and just wash them and not buy towels at all. I think that problem is still, it's trivial, but still important. Like today I've been doing a little reading about whether it would be best to rewild marginal areas of agriculture or to make those areas more efficient so that already wilded areas can be preserved and we can meet our demands for food by using what we have already taken out of the natural environment. So as we talk about the needs for doing this theological understanding, which is incredibly important, I think we need to also have education about what this ecology is really about.
Thank you, Don. And that really hammers home too. We need to be permission giving if we're going to make progress, because some of us want to go from ecological illiteracy to graduate school in one fell swoop. And what's really needed is for us to start at preschool. I'll move it into a congregational context and into the lives of members of a congregation. If we don't know anything, well, then let's learn something. And if we're not doing anything, well, then let's do something. But let's do so with a strategic sense that we want to keep developing that. Let's not just stay in preschool. Let's not pat ourselves on the back because we've got recycling practices underway, because that's just scratching the tip of the surface. And let's keep learning it with humility that says, oh my goodness. But let's not look back in judgment too much either, and impugn the simple things that we now know are scarcely enough. Let's celebrate that we had that as a foundation to build on, but let's keep moving forward. Congregations have a long way to go, so let's start the journey and understand it as an ongoing journey.
I'm curious of folks if they have any thoughts about how they perhaps shifted in some of their understandings to seeing their theology as more, really affirming and engaging you into concern for the earth and for climate. I can remember it. I could look back and I just can't even understand where I was in my thoughts at this point. But I had the strangest thought. This goes back on what Dr. Hunt has been saying. At one point in my life, when we were traveling up to Colorado, which we did a lot, and seeing this beautiful field of wild flowers, but there weren't hardly any people there. And this thought came in my mind, I wonder why all these flowers are here. Because, they're not really for human people. They're not. No, this just sounds absolutely ridiculous to me. In a sense now, it was reflecting my anthropomorphic viewpoint that this whole earth was somehow related to humans' use of it. I'm really being vulnerable here, aren't I? But anyway, it just, partly, time helps you. I realized that actually a process theological perspective has been a helpful theological perspective for me in understanding God's, the Spirit's work within creation, luring us forward, and that all of creation, actually, there is some indeterminacy, even as we talk about like will and being able to respond to God and God's work within all of it, and then understanding more and more how we're interconnected into creation. We are creation is within us. There's a whole lot of ecosystems within our very own selves, and we're part of the ecosystems, and we don't, it's not that we have this very special place. We have this special responsibility because of our capacity to destroy. But
I think that's lovely. Your childhood experience of seeing flowers and having an illuminating moment that says, it's not all about me. There is an abundance in creation, a joy and a flourishing that would be going on even if I wasn't there as an audience to enjoy it. That's a good counterpart to narcissism. It's a decentering experience.
Ruth, your comment makes me think back to your other reflection on the theology of eschatology, where the goal is, for some, the goal is heaven. And so if you get, quote, saved, then you're kind of in this liminal space. You're like, well, I'm just here until the next phase happens because that's what I'm looking forward to. And it gives you kind of this permission not to act or not to respond in some way because something greater is coming. So why do any good while we're here? And I remember, gosh, many years ago, just rereading the Lord's Prayer and hearing that phrase, on earth as it is in heaven, that somehow earth is supposed to reflect the very heaven we want to experience, whatever that is for people. That's kind of that prayer was kind of a thrust back into the world in which we live, that we want, in the days we live here, we want it to be as reflective of whatever comes next as much as possible. That means our best care, our best efforts, our best minds, our best science, our best whatever to make the earth as reflective of that reality as possible. So
yeah, that's the reminder that you take one component of theology and it interlaces with another. So this sense of what it means to be the people of God in the idea of proleptic, a pre-occurring of something, that the already in against the horizon of the not yet, that we are invited to embody and experience and reflect now the ultimate promise of things, as you say, Chris. And that has lovely implications for how we translate an ecologically responsible theology into the patterns of our life now. What would it mean for us to be a bit of heaven on earth as it relates to the stewardship of this extraordinary ecosystem of which we are a part?
I find too that a lot of folks that have theologies that seem to me not to help them care for the earth or to think it's important, they also are pretty big into helping people who are suffering. There's a lot of concern for the well-being of people, or in their missions to care for them. So that I think the eco-justice part may also be a helpful entry point. In reality, climate change, and we don't even have to use those words, I guess, but not caring for the earth well is causing a lot of people to suffer right now. And, churches are sending missionaries, they're all doing all sorts of things to take care of medical needs. But if we don't care for the earth well, the suffering is going to go far beyond, even now what we can do as the church. So there might be an entry point just drawing on people's concern for others, their tendency right now for kind of the more charitable aspects of their faith, in realizing right now not caring for the earth causes suffering, and God calls us to care for those who are in need. It's one thought as also an entry point into some of those different types of theologies. Any last words, Dr. Hunt, as we're getting to the end here?
I am grateful for the opportunity for us to have this conversation. It's the nature of this conversation that it just begins. There's a lot of richness that we don't have time to talk about, and the most important thing is that edge. Come back to those motivating words from Elizabeth Johnson that talks about it's kind of where the rubber meets the road. It's how we apply, how we commit ourselves to actions in light of our faith that will ultimately make the difference, or else this is all just philosophical talk.
Yeah, well, thank you so very much. We're so appreciative of what you've given us today, that we can continue to think about, and that book might be a very good place for all of us to start if we've not had the opportunity to read it.
I really do love, and it's true of liberation theology and its distinctive contribution to perspectives that we have the image of God in solidarity with humanity and all of creation. And that as a way of understanding God's presence with us, God's presence in Christ, I think it brings, it opens the door to an ethical approach that honors the marginalized, those who suffer most at this, and comes back to the point you made just a moment ago, which is the justice connection, the ethical, where we touch at the points of pain and recognize the love of God there, identifying with those who suffer, and our prioritizing, our joining in the incarnational opportunity to join God with a suffering world toward its transformation, toward its ultimate hope.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're at the end, but I just do want to remind folks that we'll meet again in 2 weeks on October 14th, same time, same Zoom link. And that session will be focused on eco-spirituality, nurturing spirituality and faith practices in the context of climate change. Dr. Rachel Wheeler will be leading us, and she is well qualified. She's written a couple books on eco-spirituality, and I think we'll have some some interesting things to share with us. So plan to do that. So again, thank you, Dr. Hunt. Thanks to each of you for coming and being a part of this today. I'm really grateful, and have a wonderful rest of the day.